Good morning and welcome to this evidence session for the Committee on Standards in Public Life. The role of the committee is to advise the Prime Minister and the government of the day on processes and procedures for upholding high standards in public life. We are not a regulator and we don't undertake individual casework, but we take an overview of the standards system. We are pleased to be joined for this session by Sir David Normington, who was previously both the First Civil Service Commissioner and also the Commissioner for Public Appointments. From the committee side for this session, we have two of our independent members, Dr. Jane Martin and Manisha Shah, and Dame Margaret Beckett MP, one of our political members who represents the Labour Party. For our 25th anniversary as a committee, 25 years since Lord Nolan's first report, which established the 7 principles of public life, we commissioned some academic work to look at the complex tapestry of standards bodies that have grown up in this country over the last decades. And on the back of that, our current inquiry, Standards Matters 2, is to look at where there may be gaps or overlaps or shortfalls and to make recommendations for improvement on the overall landscape of public standards, and also to call out areas of best practice. Just for those who have not watched these sessions before, we are obviously broadcasting on our YouTube channel, but we will not be looking at specific cases, and particularly we will not be commenting on any cases that are currently before the courts. So I think without more ado, I will welcome Sir David. Thank you very much indeed for being with us this morning, and move into our questions. So the 7 principles of public life are now 25, 26 years since they were first articulated. What do you see as the role of those standards in promoting standards in public life more widely?
Well, they are the starting point. I've always regarded them as the sort of national statement of standards of behaviour in public life. And they are the starting point, or if you like, the framework for behaviour in public office. I think it's quite a remarkable story, really. If you were in any other country, you would have gone straight to putting these into the law. But actually, these have got great resonance by not being in the law, but actually by being very widely accepted, and actually accepted beyond people holding public offices. I think you find them used in the charitable sector, in the university sector. You see them used, and in some parts of the private sector, you see them used quite widely. So they're not enough by themselves, but I think they've become quite a powerful starting point.
Do you think that there is anything that needs to be added or changed? We've noted that in some other jurisdictions, an additional standard principle has been set up, which is to do with respect because of concern about things such as bullying and harassment. Do you think that we need to reflect that in the overarching 7 principles?
It's interesting because I've heard you discussing that, and when we had all the controversy about the bullying by the Home Secretary before Christmas, it caused me to look at the 7 principles of public life, and there's nothing in there which directly relates to that issue. And I think probably, therefore, the principles of public life do need upgrading in some way to reflect what is happening in public life now. And in fact, moving away from the Home Secretary's case, there is a lot of bullying and harassment on social media of people in public office and so on. I think that somehow the 7 principles of public life don't have that in them. They reflect some other concerns of other times, and not that one. So I think there is a scope for updating them. I think you probably need to preserve the 7 somehow. I think probably we've got used to 7, so it'd be better not to have 8. But I think, I don't know whether the word is respect, tolerance, compassion, understanding. It's in that nexus of issues, really, much more clearly about the behaviour of people in public office to each other and to the public.
Thank you. Taking the sort of the long view, and obviously you have a distinguished career in public service and continue to take an interest in these areas, how well do you think that ethical standards are currently upheld across British public life?
Well, across British public life, we continue to have pretty high standards. And in a way, the examples of that are when individuals or governments, local councils, a big issue at the moment, don't observe them. So we pride ourselves on having a public service which is honest and full of integrity and so on. If you ask me about now, I don't like saying this, but I will say it anyway. We're in a phase where ethical standards are not being sufficiently upheld by the government. And there are too many examples of that for it to be an isolated problem. Now, these things sometimes go in phases, so I hope it's not a trend. It may be a phase related to a new government, which has been elected with quite a large majority, and so on. So I hope it's a settling in phase, but I think we have to be on our guard that we are not seeing. One of the principles of public life is about leadership, and we're not seeing from the top enough leadership to call out poor behavior. It specifically says in our 7 principles of public life, you should, as a leader, be willing to challenge poor behavior wherever it occurs. And we haven't seen that coming. And these are quite a limited number of examples. But of course, if the people at the top in government do not set an example, it ripples through the system. Their failure to set an example has a disproportionate impact.
So from your point of view, what would effective leadership on ethical standards from government look like?
Well, I would first of all think that admitting when standards have not met the 7 standards in public life and apologising for it, being accountable for things that are falling below those standards, and admitting that that is happening, and preferably taking some action. I know, look, I've been in public life long enough to know how difficult that is for a prime minister or a cabinet minister, but my experience of prime ministers over most of the years that I've been in public life is that when the chips are down, they stand up for these standards. And it's so important that prime ministers do that. And sometimes that involves them taking action against others, which they would greatly prefer not to take. But generally they do it because it's in the interests of ethical standards in government. So sometimes you have to be willing to stand up and say, yeah, we've made a mistake here. I'm going to take some action to put that right. And by the way, Peter Riddell said this earlier, it's not always about sacking people, you know. There's far too much sacking of people in public life, but it is about admitting that there are problems and trying to put those right.
Okay. We currently have a standards framework with the 7 principles at the top, with sector-specific codes of practice and codes of conduct, and then a range of standards regulators with various levels of power and statutory authority. Do you think that that's an effective overall framework? And if not, how do you think it might be improved?
Well, there are two answers to that. The overall framework, I think, is only as good as the behaviour and restraint of those in power or in public office. And you can have all the frameworks you like, all the codes you like, but if people in public office are trying to get round them or ignore them or undermine them, then that will be a problem. And it's very difficult to put that right, whatever framework you have. But secondly, of course, and it's one of your tasks really, I think it's important that we look at elements of that framework from time to time to see whether they're working. At the moment, the independent advisor to the Prime Minister, that's a particular issue that doesn't seem to be working very well. You've just had a conversation about the business appointments rules. I think they're a mess. So there are things that need putting right. And perhaps the third thing to say is this is all in the end, in my view, not about regulating behaviour just. It's about giving people public confidence that we have an ethical system. And of course, most people have no idea what the rules are and what the codes are and so on. But people do have a sense about whether things are being done properly and ethically. And so that's why I come back to the framework and the leadership within that framework and the willingness to uphold that framework. So it's not always about the individual elements of it, it's about how people behave ultimately. But of course, the codes, the detailed arrangements can help that behavior. And when there is a difficult case, can help the regulators, for instance, to stand up and say, no, this was done fairly, this is done properly, you can have confidence.
Thank you. Some of the evidence that we have heard has called for a much more consolidated and statutory regulatory system, perhaps with an overarching ethics regulator of some sort. Is that a model that would attract you, or would you not find that a good idea?
Well, I don't think it will necessarily solve any problem. I think that I come back to my point. I think you can make the existing system work, and it sounds nice and neat to have everything in some sort of legal framework. But if we operated with transparency and accountability, the present framework, I think it would be fine. You could argue for putting some regulators together, but we'll come on to the problem of putting regulators together in a minute, because I had 2 of those roles. But on the whole, I'm not in favour of this. Look, it took 150 years to get the Civil Service Commission into legislation. So I don't think there's going to be a lot of parliamentary time devoted to that kind of thing. It's better to try to make the existing system work, I think.
So come back to that one in the next century.
You could suggest it, though, if you like. It just may not happen.
Thank you. I'm going to hand over to Dr. Jane Martin.
Thank you, and good morning, Sir David.
Morning.
Good morning. So, yeah, indeed, I would like to, get your reflections on the roles that you've held of Civil Service Commissioner and the Commissioner for Public Appointments, which indeed you did hold at the same time. And one of the issues that we're really interested in is, of course, the degree of independence and authority that standards regulators need to have in order to have all the proper sort of tools in the box, as it were, to do the job. So interested sort of broadly on what you think about how we get that right. And also perhaps just to touch on the issues of, you ran one statutory based scheme and one non-statutory based scheme. And I think, as you've already alluded, this isn't the key issue, but we would be very interested to hear from you about sort of how that affected each regulator, well or otherwise. Thank you.
I might start on that point, if I may. So it seemed like a good idea at the time, putting the 2 roles into one person. It didn't turn out all that well, and it actually, just to correct the point, both roles had a statutory basis, but one, of course, was in primary legislation in the CRAG Act 2010, and the other one was in an ordering council. The Public Appointments Commissioner was in an ordering council.
Yeah.
They did, though, when I took over in 2011, broadly have the same approach, which was to set out the principles of the system, the essentials of the system, and to give the power to the regulator in each case to set out how, in a code or in recruitment principles as they became known in the Commission, Civil Service Commission, to set out some of the details of how those things should be done. And for the first 2 or 3 years, there was no problem with that. But then the government of the day got more, to put it politely, activist in trying to get its supporters into roles and wanting to have also a greater say in civil service and permanent secretary appointments. And of course, you should never need to look back at your statutory base, but when you are under pressure or you are in a more controversial situation, that is what you do. And of course, as others have said to you, if I looked then at the civil service legislation, that gave me absolute clarity of my powers. And I knew that those powers and the Commission's powers could not be changed except by going back to Parliament.
Yeah.
The Ordering Council, I knew, could be changed by a stroke of the pen and a nod of the Privy Council. And that did mean that I suddenly felt very vulnerable to an argument with government about the principles, because I knew that it was perfectly within the government's power, with very little public debate and accountability to Parliament, to change the rules. And of course, after I left, and I left in a bit of a blaze of publicity because I was so annoyed about it. That's not my way normally, but I was very annoyed. The government changed the rules and were able to do it very easily. And they changed the rules in a very significant way for public appointments. The rules for the civil service, although we changed some of the details about ministerial involvement, the basic legislative position remained the same. And this is one of the things that Peter Riddell and I have debated from time to time, is that when things are going well and ministers are showing restraint, then the legal bases are fine. When there are problems, that's when the legal bases start mattering. And also when the details start to matter, because we'll come on, I guess, to the powers of the Commissioner on Public Appointments. But what happened after I'd stood down, and it was timed so that I wasn't there, which is government's privilege, you can do that. What happened was that the whole system that I had operated was dismantled. And the government put something else in place, and that's the system under which Peter Riddell is currently operating. That was done with almost no public discussion, no parliamentary debate. I did, though, with Bernard Jenkins' help, he was the chair of the Public Administration Committee at that time, did highlight the issue, and there was a report from the Public Administration Committee about it. So we did get the issue of the change put into the public domain, but we had to work very hard to do it.
Thank you. So may I just play back to you the point you've made on, and I recognise your correction to the question on, statutory versus non-statutory. So thank you for that. But would it be fair for me to summarise that because of the primary legislation underpinning of the Civil Service Commissioner role, that gave you more certainty, more clarity, and security, if I can put it that way, in your position as an independent authority, whereas in the other role that was less so the case? I mean, is that fair to say?
Yes, that's absolutely fair, because but it's not just about, yes, it gave me security, but it also gave it set down, that is what the civil service legislation does, it sets down the principles on which the system operates. So
Yes.
it says on the face of the Act,
Yes.
you have to appoint on merit after open competition. And also it sets down the four principles, the values of the civil service. It doesn't set down the detail of how it is all to be done, but it does set down the principles. And if I may make the point, the Order in Council I inherited in 2011 also set down the principles. So you can do it in an Order in Council. It said on the face of the order that merit in public appointments and the promotion and ensuring of merit in public appointments was the job of the Commissioner. That is no longer in the Order in Council now. It was taken out in 2016. So the principle of merit, which was Lord Nolan's overriding principle, was not carried through into the Order in Council after 2016. So it's a long way of making the point. I'm simply saying you can use Orders in Council to have the same approach as you've got in the civil service legislation, the primary legislation, but of course you can change the Order in Council very quickly and very easily, and that was what was done. And we may come on to what the current arrangements are, but basically the Order in Council now says, and I paraphrase, of course it doesn't say this, ministers can set the rules and do what they like.
Yeah. So, well, perhaps let me just go there then. You know, your fears about undermining of appointments by merit, has that been borne out? What is your feeling now about the way in which things are operating?
Well, no, it hasn't. You see, my concerns have not been fully borne out, but I think, but they could be. And there was a big debate, controversy, slightly stirred up by me. I say big one, I mean it was a small one really, but people don't normally debate these things much. And Peter Riddell, when he took over from me, managed to negotiate some things which pulled the government back from the extreme position that had been in the Grimstone report on which it was taking its decisions. So he was able to negotiate the ability to be consulted and also to ensure that when he was consulted that there were senior independent members on panels. He also negotiated the ability to be consulted when ministers wanted to make appointments without there being a proper competition. And he has used those very skillfully, along with judicious transparency and publicity, to restrain ministerial behaviour that oversteps the mark. But I just have to say that to begin with, he had a Prime Minister who observed the principles in the code and made sure that her ministers did as well. We are in a phase now where some of those things now seem to be more under challenge. And as I said earlier, when things are under challenge, the powers of this commissioner are very weak indeed. And he has to fall back on calling out behaviour publicly as his and reporting on it and investigating it, which is a power and of some significance. He has to do that because he has very little other powers.
Understand, thank you. And just before we move on, because we will I think ask a few more questions about the public appointments situation. Can I just please ask you about reflecting again on your role, you know, in your both those roles. There are a number of codes in operation, aren't there, as a result of the way in which the regulatory landscape has emerged, civil service code, governance code and public appointments, etc. And they have all operated differently, and indeed the ownership of the governance code changed. My short question really is, what makes an effective code in upholding standards? What would you, if you, advising us as a committee, what are the key things that we need to hang on to, let alone inconsistencies per se?
Yes, just to say one thing about those different codes. Of course, they serve different purposes. It's important that the codes are designed for and owned by the different people for whom they operate. So the Civil Service Code is a very important part of the civil servant's contract, and therefore is owned within the civil service and is very important to that. The other two codes are very important to the regulation of particular parts of the system. So it's necessary to have, even though it looks confusing, to have those different codes, I think, as we were discussing earlier. I think that there are a number of things you need in a successful bit of regulation. You do need a clear and understandable legal base. You do, I think, need to then have some kind of code, whether you call it a code or not, which elaborates on that, but is as principles based and light touch as possible, because codes get undermined when they're full of irritating and unnecessary detail. Regulators should not be in the business of telling people almost how to blow their nose. I think that one thing that didn't come up this morning in the discussions enough was the code is partly, and the arrangements are partly about public reassurance and public acceptability. And you sometimes put things in there which you may not think are going to be used, but which can be pointed to when the public say, well, this isn't a very independent system, is it? So public reassurance is important. Transparency has to be an essential part of a system. And there has to be somewhere in this a process of independent adjudication or oversight. There has to be somebody or somewhere that, in a sense, calls to account those who are behaving within the framework that's been set and is able to say that is not in line with the code. So those are some of the things that I would have in mind. But there's one other thing I want to say is that you have to have acceptance and consent from those who are being regulated. And this brings me back to public appointments. It's the starting point for public appointments is that ministers make these appointments, and there's nothing wrong with that. And you have to allow ministers to have some choice of candidates who are going to lead major public bodies, to which the government has in a way outsourced great chunks of public administration and so on. And you need to be sure as a minister that you have got people in those roles who are both going to do a good job, but are also going to work within the political framework you've set. And therefore, it's no use having a public appointments regulatory system which tries to stop ministers making choices. I think Peter Riddell was saying this too, and that is rather different from the civil service position, which is much more restrictive of ministerial choice, and I think rightly, because effectively you're appointing a different category of people. But in public appointments, and so consent has to come from not trying to regulate away something which is completely unacceptable and unrealistic to those who are being regulated.
Thank you very much. That's a really very, very helpful distinction that we need to understand. That's all from me. I'm handing over to Manish Shah now. Thank you very much.
Good morning, Sir David.
Hello.
Hello. I wanted to talk a bit further about this role of the Public Appointments Commissioner that you've been talking about. And in light of your comments about how you have seen the role develop and your conversations with Peter Riddell, how would you reform the role today? In your view, is that role still too weak?
You mean the Public Appointments Commissioner, you mean? Yes. Well, it's no use just saying I'd like it to go back to what it was when I took it over because it was working fine. But because that is really what I think, but it's probably unrealistic to expect that. So I think that I would focus, and I think Peter this morning was saying some of this, I would focus on strengthening the role of the independent member. Because now in my time, the independent member chaired significant public appointments, and I think that gave quite a lot more reassurance. The other thing was, though, if you don't want to do that, the independent members that I had, they were called assessors, were people I had selected through a proper process of recruitment and trained. And I think that the most significant short-term change that could be made would be to have a register of senior independent members that is owned and maintained by the Commissioner. You would still agree with the Secretary of State which of those people was going to be the independent member on any review, but they would be restricted to choosing from those that register of independent members. And as I say, those people would be appointed through a proper recruitment process. And I think that will be a step in the right direction. I think, secondly, I would remove the power which says that ministers can appoint an unappointable person, somebody judged unappointable. I mean, honestly, it's just daft, isn't it, that? So you go through all this process, you have an advisory committee that does all the recruitment, they recommend a list of people, and then ministers on the face of the code can appoint somebody else. If you want a way of undermining public confidence in an appointment, that is the way to do it. Actually, of course, it's so daft that ministers have never done it. But that doesn't mean to say they won't. So I just take that away. And I think longer term, but I think it is longer term, I would try to move this regulator to a statutory basis in primary legislation. Since it took a long time to do that for the civil service, it's not going to happen anytime soon, certainly not the present government, it just won't want to do it. But I think that doesn't stop us continuing to argue for that and actually putting back into the law some of the principles that are currently in the code. Because as I read the present position, ministers have complete control over how they draft the rules and how they then abide by the rules. And the Commissioner is consigned to popping up from time to time to say, I've looked into this and I don't think these rules are being applied properly. But I think that is too weak. So I would want to put the principle of merit in public appointments, and maybe to define it rather differently from the way in which it's in the civil service legislation and codes, back into legislation. But I think that's not going to happen so soon. So I think I would do some of the shorter term, smaller things that I've just described. I heard Peter Riddell talking about the composition of panels. And here we are again. There was this appointment recently where the panel was packed with 3 Conservative supporters. That is a ludicrous thing to do because it undermines the person who has been appointed, when actually he might have been perfectly, if he is any good, and I have no reason to think otherwise, he would have come through the process anyway. And actually, everybody, including ministers, have an interest in having a proper process which produces a list of appointable candidates from which they can choose, because that not only increases public confidence, but it increases the authority of the person appointed.
So do you feel that the commissioner should have the power to demand the rerunning of competitions?
Providing he didn't use it very often. I mean, all these powers should be backstop powers, it may be a step too far. That if you ask me, really, yes, I think that would be a good backstop power. But if we go back to my principle that you have to have the consent of those who are being regulated, that is likely, I think, to be a step too far for ministers, who, after all, are the elected ones. And therefore, maybe they should have the final say rather than somebody else.
May I ask, thank you very much. May I ask you about prominent unregulated appointments, including non-executive directors of departmental bodies? How should we approach that question of unregulated appointments? Is it about greater transparency, or should we be seeking to ensure that they are in fact a rarity?
I think I smiled listening to Peter Riddell's evidence on this, because if you look back at my annual reports and my statements, this was something I was also calling for, just as he was, and indeed as the Jerry Grimstone report called for. I mean, I think one has to start with transparency, because, as he said, we do not know which appointments are unregulated. We only know them when they're a source of controversy, when somebody pops up and says, well, who appointed this person? But we do not have, we have a list of which appointments are within scope of the Ordering Council. We do not have a list of those which are not. And the starting point would be to have a list of those which are not. So at least we could debate the pros and cons of bringing them in. There may be perfectly good reasons for excluding them. And I would say that they have to, short-term task forces and so on are not going to be within scope. People brought in as government advisors for certain things probably are not in scope. So we're looking for substantial appointments over a period of time. I think the debate about non-executives on departmental bodies is a very interesting one. I personally think it's completely unacceptable that those appointments are not made through a proper competition, because those people are there, in my view, to defend and challenge in the public interest. They ought to be anyway. That's what non-executives do. On other bodies I serve on, mainly in charities, the independent or external members are there to bring external perspective and judgment and challenge, and not necessarily to do what the executive want. That doesn't mean to say that ministers can't appoint people who they have confidence in, and that must be so. But I think the role is too important for it to be appointed in the shadows without us really understanding how that's come about.
Thank you very much. So David, that's the end of my questions. If I may hand over to Dame Margaret.
Thank you very much. I just want to briefly take you back, Sir David, to one aspect of regulated appointments. Do you think that there is any particular merit in a regulated appointments process in terms of securing diversity in appointments?
I'm broadly of the view that all regulators and all regulatory systems should have the promotion of diversity as one of their duties and responsibilities. I think that isn't just about putting it in the sort of principles, the headline principles, it's about seeing it carried through. I, as Public Appointments Commissioner, and Peter Riddell has continued this, actually it was in the Ordering Council in my day that I was there to promote diversity in appointments. And that meant that I was interested in how panels were comprised and making sure that the panels were diverse and able to choose people from diverse backgrounds, that I looked from time to time at how long lists and short lists were being put together. So a lot of the work is about promotion of diversity, but I think it has to be carried through in a regulated system to make sure that you are looking at the places where the barriers to diversity exist. So I'm very much with Peter Riddell this morning in saying the main job is to promote diversity, and he was right to say a lot of progress has been made in public appointments, much more over the last 10 years than I could possibly have imagined. But I think you have to give the regulator the ability to look at the end-to-end system and say, where could the barriers be? Because this is not just about promotion, it's about often the nuts and bolts of the system and where one is sending signals to people about who you expect to apply for these roles. Because one thing I did in my time was we looked at both how the appointments were advertised and what the job descriptions said, because very often that can send out signals which says don't apply, and it's certainly the case, I think, although it's changing, that there are some sectors of the public, particularly I think in Black and minority ethnic communities, who are less willing to apply for public appointments because they get the message that they don't think that they'll be chosen. That is changing, but we have to go on working at it.
I think that's an extremely pertinent point. You've been very open and frank about your view of some of the weaknesses of the present system. Do you think that the way that the appointments process is perceived may particularly now be a potential barrier for a greater diversity of applicants? I'm thinking in particular, I think it was Peter Riddell who mentioned it this morning, of things like the pre-leaking of potentially suitable names. Is this one of the additional barriers that we don't actually need to have?
I think so. I really do think so. I mean, I think if you, and this applies almost to anybody who applies, in fact, if you think that there's a secret, or actually in the case of leaking, not a very secret, short list of favoured candidates, why would you bother to put yourself forward for it? This happened in my time as well, and like Peter, I challenged it quite hard. I think it does put people off. And if you think there are barriers to certain sectors of the public applying, then this is an additional barrier. It's not the only one, but it is. And I think, you know, Lord Nolan was very wise. He said there isn't a lot of evidence that lots of public appointments are being given to political friends and cronies, but that's what the public think.
Yeah.
And the impact of doing things that give the impression that it's all a closed shop and that nobody, that you're only going to apply if you're a friend of the Prime Minister, the impact of that on public perceptions can, and I think does, knock on to who applies and whether they're willing to apply. Because it can be quite a long, drawn out and quite demanding process. However, just set aside alongside that, we have made quite a lot of progress, as Peter Riddell was describing this morning. I saw in my time the proportion of women appointed creeping up through the 40%, and now it's gone over 50. I see some progress on Black and minority ethnic candidates. I think there's more to do there, and I'd like to see that creep to more important appointments and not just some of the less important ones, because I think some of these figures need deconstructing a bit. And then we had much less progress on disability. That is sometimes about how these jobs are advertised and how they are recruited for, and whether there is a real attempt. You know, I'm sorry to go on, I won't go on much longer. In my other life now, in the charitable sector, we have begun to make, and in the university sector, we've begun to make enormous efforts to attract diverse fields and to make sure the system is as welcoming to appointees and potential candidates as possible. And that we all need to go on making sure that happens across public life.
Thank you very much, Sir David.
Thank you. Could I, as we sort of come towards the end, could I just add another couple of questions? The first is, you made reference to the fact that at some level, regulators need to have the consent of those that they regulate. Do you have any ideas on how you actually build that consent? What is it that might encourage those who are being regulated to see the benefit of regulation and to consent to it?
Well, in the end, this is about how the democratic system works. We haven't said much about Parliament because I haven't really been asked about that. But I would like personally to see Parliament being much more active in the promotion of the principles of public life and how they get carried into different regulatory systems. I think that we need to look for ways, if we're talking about the government, we need to look for ways as members of the public of demanding high standards from government and speaking up when we see those standards not being met. So the basic principles have to come, I think, from public pressure. And one of the main elements of the way that is articulated, or ought to be, is through Parliament. That's why we have our representatives. The second thing is, I think you have to construct systems which are about agreement and try to balance the powers. Just going back to the Public Appointments Commissioner, he has the right to be consulted, but he doesn't have the right to agree. Almost nowhere is his power to agree. And I think that it works both ways, this. I think you can only get certain amount of way by requiring agreement. But I think constructing legal systems which require, regulatory systems which require agreement rather than consultation may help as well. And I think, going back to Manisha's question about the sort of backstop powers, sometimes you do need a backstop power, because I think that in the end is the thing. When I was the Civil Service Commissioner and ministers announced to Parliament that they wanted to have choice in permanent secretary appointments, because they couldn't do that without my agreement, they had in the end very, very reluctantly, very reluctantly to sit down and discuss it. And therefore we had to come to a satisfactory outcome, and we did. It's not a very satisfactory answer to your question, because actually, Jonathan, it's unanswerable, isn't it? But I think those are some of the ways.
Thank you. And finally, and I am going to touch a little bit on Parliament here, Peter Riddell has suggested that there needs perhaps to be two categories of public appointments: those which are there to deliver the government's programme, and there are many agencies important in doing that. But then there are another category of public regulators whose job it is to oversee standards issues, sometimes including standards within government, and therefore they have a sort of ethical role. And he has suggested that it might be important to have greater independence from ministers in the appointment of the latter group rather than the former. And one of the suggestions, for instance, is that appointments to those latter groups might need to have some kind of parliamentary scrutiny. And I guess we see that to some extent in the appointment of the Electoral Commission chair. Does that distinction seem to you to be a helpful one? And do you have any views, if you do think it's helpful, as to how that could be implemented?
I think one should make that distinction. I think that if we're to have confidence in the ethical regulators, we need to have confidence in the way they are appointed. And because, as we've been discussing, the system is so weak in relation to the way public appointments work, the present system gives ministers a lot of control over who are appointed to ethical regulators. I wouldn't take them out altogether, but I would try and build a system around the kind of principles that are in the civil service legislation, where ministers do have a role, but it is a controlled role because you're appointing people who are by definition and have to be impartial and politically impartial. And I think, I'm not saying we should just lift the Civil Service Commission role, but I think there is a model there where you have independent chairmanship. And I do think that that needs to work with parliamentary scrutiny. One of my, I've said this already, but I'll say it again, one of the things that helped me in my time was the Public Administration Committee, chaired by Bernard Jenkin, that saw it as one of its roles to support the ethical regulators. I don't precisely know whether we should give them the power in each case to agree and perhaps to veto the appointments, but I'd certainly be willing to consider that. So you have a process which produces which still allows ministers to make a choice at the end, but much more on the civil service model, where the choice is very restricted and where their involvement in the process has been more limited, and then a beefed up role for Parliament, because we need to have confidence that the ethical regulators are independent. I heard the question earlier about whether ministers could, or former ministers could, fill this role. I don't think you should have a proper system that I've described. You should rule out no category of people who might be suitable for that role. You should simply put them through a rigorous, independently led system. And if they come out at the other end, then that's fine. There are plenty of former ministers who could do some of these roles well. There is an issue about what the public would think about that. And I think that is something that, in a sense, the independent panel would need to consider in the recruitment process. But I wouldn't rule politicians out as a group. I think that they're in public life as well. And many are very distinguished. And I'm not just saying that because Margaret Beckett's here. There are many distinguished public servants in Parliament, and they don't get enough credit for it.
That leads us to the end of the questions. So David, thank you very much indeed for your help on this inquiry and for